Good evening. Welcome to Sydney Sussex College. Welcome to another Cambridge Polish Studies event. My name is Stanley Bill. I'm the lecturer in Polish Studies here at Cambridge. And if you could please join me in welcoming our special guests today, Edward Lucas, senior editor at The Economist, and Peter Hitchens, columnist for The Mail on Sunday. I've chosen a rather provocative title for this evening's event. Between Russia and Germany, Poland and the shifting European order. It is something of a cliche in Polish historiography that the curse of the nation's history lies in its geopolitical location between these two great powers of Germany and Russia in their various historical manifestations. But of course, this narrative is something of a simplification for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that this narrative excludes or elides the existence of the peoples or nations between Poland and Russia on Poland's eastern border. And of course, I'm talking about the Lithuanians and the various peoples inhabiting in the medieval period the Kievan Rus, the Ruthenians, later Ukrainians and Belarusians. And it is also a fact that in the struggles for self-determination of these peoples between Poland and Russia, these nations have very often defined these struggles for self-determination as struggles against both Poland and Russia in the various political manifestations of these nations, be it subsumed into a Polish state in union with a Polish state. Why do I mention this problem with the narrative of Poland between Russia and Germany from the very beginning? Because clearly, in this evening's discussion, the question of Ukraine will be extremely important. So some of the things that I think need to be discussed and that we might see discussed this evening will be the questions of what Poland's role is in the current Ukraine crisis. We might ask, why does Poland appear to have been sidelined from the highest level negotiations in connection with this crisis, when Poland is, after all, the only country in the European Union to share borders with both Ukraine and Russia? Why has this happened? How has this happened? In whose interests is it that this has happened? More broadly, what should Poland's role within the European Union or within NATO be? What should Poland's strategy towards Ukraine, towards Russia, and towards its allies in NATO and its fellow members of the European Union be? What has it been and how has it changed in recent times, where we have seen not a change of government, but a change of the governing team in Poland? But then we would like to take this further and broaden the question once again to the question of what the role of Europe is in the current crisis in Ukraine, what Europe's relations with Russia should be, and more specifically, what the relations might be between Germany, the most powerful, at least economically, probably politically, country in the European Union. And for this purpose, I'd like to outline from the beginning that Edward Lucas has a great deal of knowledge and understanding of Poland.
So does Peter.
And he will be speaking more specifically on those questions that relate to Poland. Well, perhaps he won't. He'll speak about what he would like to speak about under the broad topic that we've supplied. Peter Hitchens, on the other hand, does not claim to be an expert in things Polish, so his contribution to the discussion, although I believe he will have things to say about Poland and Poland's role, but his role tonight is a broader one to talk about this Russian-German relation or this Russian-German negotiation. We've chosen two of the most influential journalists, authors, and opinion formers in the United Kingdom for this event, but they're also clearly thinkers who represent different perspectives on some of the questions that we wish to discuss this evening. And that's precisely why we've chosen to bring these two together tonight, for a discussion, a debate, and I would very much like to involve all of you in that discussion and debate as the evening progresses. So just to give a brief outline of the structure of the evening. First of all, I would like to give the floor to each of the speakers, one after another, for around 10 to 15 minutes maximum, to present a general perspective on the questions at hand. And then there will be replies from each speaker, and I would expect to see an exchange of perspectives, which then we will open to all of you to participate. That's the general idea of the evening. Just very briefly before we begin, I should introduce the guests in a little more depth. Edward Lucas is presently a senior editor at The Economist. He's the former chief of the Moscow bureau. He's the author of a number of books, including, most famously and perhaps presciently, The New Cold War, Putin's Russia and the Threat to the West, Deception, Spies, Lies and How Russia Dupes the West, and The Snowden Operation, Inside the West's Greatest Intelligence Disaster. Peter Hitchens, among other things, is presently a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. He's also formerly a foreign correspondent in Moscow, also in Washington. He's the author of multiple books, including The Abolition of Britain, The Broken Compass, How British Politics Lost Its Way, The Rage Against God, and The War We Never Fought. So please, if you could join me once again in welcoming our guests. Give the floor to Edward Lucas.
Well, thanks very much indeed. I should say that I'm not speaking here on behalf of The Economist. Our Moscow office has quite enough problems without me adding to them, so I'm speaking here in my representative as a senior vice president of a think tank in Washington, which none of you have ever heard of, but you can Google if you want. One of the many great Polish proverbs is nic o nas bez nas, nothing about us without us. And I think there's something a bit odd about having two Brits discussing the fate of Poland. At least it's not a Brit and a German discussing the fate of Czechoslovakia. But I'm very aware of the irony of Poland having itself discussed in a foreign country by foreigners, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Polish voices in the course of the discussion. And I want to say right up front, there are a lot of things that I agree with Peter about. I'm not just talking about our common loathing for cars, our common love for railways, particularly steam railways, the fact that we bemoan that we can't go between Oxford and Cambridge by train, our love for Core Evensong, the many things, other things. But also we agree quite a lot about the subject we're talking about tonight. We both agree that Vladimir Putin is a sinister tyrant, a very good phrase which Peter has coined and I use regularly. And I think we also both agree that the British perspective on European history is an extremely foreshortened and distorted one. We still think of the Second World War as being a kind of the good war, where Britain acted virtuously at all points and triumphed at the end to general applause, whereas I'd argue that that was almost exactly the other way around. So I'm very happy to be talking about what I think is the heart of the problem, which is the geopolitics of the countries in between Germany and Russia, because on their fate turns the fate of the whole continent. I also just want to point out that Peter is a brilliant debater, and one of his most impressive tricks is what we might call strawmanism, where he says, some people say this and it's entirely stupid. And so I want to get right out of the way at the beginning that I'm not arguing in any way, shape or form that the West is wonderful. I don't think the EU's got it right. I've been a very sharp critic of the EU over many years. I'm not saying that NATO has got it right. I've been a sharp critic of them. I am incensed and very disappointed by many things that have happened in Ukraine over the past 25 years, including under this government. So I'm not here to defend any of that. But what I am going to say is that I think the Polish view of Europe and the Polish actions over the last 25 years have been correct and should be applauded and have a lot to teach the rest of Europe, and I wish that Poland had been more successful. And the first point in this is to understand, which I think is the absolute centre of this, that the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, broadly speaking the captive nations or ex-captive nations, the countries that were against their will, first of all occupied by the Nazis and then supposedly liberated, but in fact occupied by the Soviets. These are real countries. They have real languages, they have real people, and they have real wishes. And it behoves us to respect those wishes and not tell those countries that they've got it wrong. Now, we may disagree. We may say that's a bad thing to want to do. We think it won't work out for you, and we are sorry you're taking that course. But I think we have to accept that if a majority of Ukrainians want a Euro, in shorthand, a Euro-Atlantic orientation, if they want to get closer to the European Union, if they dream of joining the European Union, if they're standing there waving EU flags and sometimes dying in blood-soaked EU flags, chanting, perhaps very unusually, Ashton, Ashton, the first and perhaps only time that the EU's rather undistinguished foreign policy represented kind of cheering crowds greeting her on the arrival of a country that desperately wanted to be represented by her and the other rather undistinguished commissioners of the European Union. Well, that is a real thing. That is not what Marcuse called false consciousness. That is something that we have to respect. We may say, as I think Peter believes, that the EU is just the German Empire in disguise, and that if you join the EU, you sacrifice your sovereignty and you sacrifice your right to control your borders, you sacrifice your economic decency. Maybe the EU is just the civilian arm of NATO, or maybe NATO is the armed wing of the EU. These are also views which Peter, I'm sure, will expand. And maybe that's true. It doesn't alter the fact that Poland was right, had the right to join the EU and had the right to join NATO. And I'd argue this has been a tremendous success. You only have to look at a country like Moldova, which perhaps back in the early 90s could have taken a different choice and might have clambered onto that Brussels train and didn't, to see what life looks like when you're outside. Poland has never in its history been safer, freer, more prosperous. It's never had more friends. This is an enormous success story, and I think that the joining NATO and the EU is a very important part of that. I also think that this rules-based order in which countries are able to make choices is worth defending. Now, this predates the collapse of the Soviet Union. It started really with the Helsinki Final Act 1975, which created the beginnings of a European security order. It was consolidated in the Paris Charter of 1990. It had a very important footnote in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where Russia and the United States, Britain, then rather belatedly Britain, France and China, because they were nuclear powers as well, agreed that in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, it would not be subject to coercion. And it's interesting to know that Russia didn't sign that with little coddles or with some ifs and buts and maybes. They didn't say, we will recognise Ukraine's sovereignty conditionally, assuming it doesn't sign a free trade agreement with the EU. It didn't say, we will accept your sovereignty, assuming you don't drive a hard bargain with us over gas. It didn't even mention Crimea and Sevastopol. That was an unconditional recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty. It was an important part of that security order. It carried on with the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 and the NATO-Russia Council of 2002, when, in a different era, Russia was not objecting to NATO expansion. The argument we were hearing then from Russia is these countries have nothing to fear from us. But if you argue these countries have nothing to fear from you, then you can't really object if the fact they want to take precaution against the sort of country they fear you may become. Now, Peter asked a very good question, which is in a piece which I have now lost, but had with me, and we'll try and quote it again from The Spectator. He said he'd never had a convincing answer yet to the Lucas filing system trumps. He said here, I have never received I've never heard a clear answer to the question posed by Vladimir Putin in 2007, against whom is this expansion intended? Well, let me give as clear an answer as I can. The expansion, which was not NATO wanting to expand, these are countries pounding on NATO's door with the enormous reluctance of many NATO countries, including Germany, to let them in. It was against the fear that Russia might become the country which it has now become. And that was a very good decision. I've been imploring the Swedes and the Finns for many years to join NATO, and my argument was always join NATO while you still can, because when you really need it, it will be too late. And very interestingly now, public opinion in Sweden, even the lentil-munching, sandal-wearing pacifist Swedes, I exaggerate only slightly, have now agreed that their country is in danger because Russia has mounted 2 dummy nuclear attacks, one on Stockholm and one on their military command headquarters. Now I can see why Russia's doing that. It's part of Russia's attempt to intimidate, to divide, demoralise, to create a sphere of influence over its neighbouring countries and make them believe that resistance is hopeless. That's had an effect in Sweden. It's made the Swedes scared. I would be interested to know why Peter thinks that Russia finds it necessary to intimidate a country which is not a member of NATO, but I look forward to hearing that in due course. But Russia is systematically trying to undermine now this rule-based international security order to which it signed up so unconditionally and indeed enthusiastically over many years. We see this in many ways, not just in Ukraine. The way that Russia's pulled out of the CFE treaty, finally took the last step out of the CFE treaty. That was one of the great achievements at the end of the Cold War, of a conventional arms control regime with lots of monitoring and inspection and different limits. But Russia actually broke the CFE treaty massively in 2009, when in the combination of the Ladoga and Zapad 09 exercises, the biggest military exercises that Europe had seen since the days of the 1980s, Russian forces, 10,000 in one, 15,000 in the other, rehearsed the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states and followed it up with a nuclear attack on Warsaw. And that finally got through to NATO that we had a security problem in Europe. After many years when NATO had the motto, out of area or out of business, NATO's only job, perhaps apart from a little bit of residual peacekeeping in the Balkans, NATO's only job was expeditionary warfare. And finally the wheels began to turn. With enormous reluctance, NATO agreed that they could do contingency plans for Poland and the Baltic states, and then followed that up again with enormous reluctance, particularly German resistance, to having exercise. And now we are beginning to get back to the stage where, at least on paper, we may be able to present some sort of military resistance in the event of a Russian attack on Poland and the Baltic states, but we're not there yet, and Russia knows we're not there yet. And when I go to Warsaw, I talk to very serious Poles at very high level who think it's not a probability, but it's a possibility, and a serious possibility, that Poland may have to fight alone. This is really astonishing to me, that after 25 years at the end of the Cold War, people are talking quite seriously about what is the evacuation plan from Warsaw. Now, I was talking to one quite senior Pole who asked his ministry, his party body, what's the evacuation plan? His officials came back to him 48 hours later, and they said, the good news is that we found the evacuation plan. The bad news is it's from 1986 and it involves evacuating to Bialystok. But these are really serious worries now. If you live in this part of Europe and you see these Russian military drills, the enormous nuclear rearmament of these very small Russian nuclear weapons that only can be, this is not the old Dr. Strangelove balance of terror sort of nuclear weapons. These are battlefield nuclear weapons, nuclear howitzers, nuclear depth charges, nuclear mines, whose only role is to be used in an actual war. This is not part of the theology of nuclear deterrence. And Russia is making these at a very fast rate at a time when Europe and the United States have pretty much got rid of them. And they're stockpiling them in Kaliningrad and putting them on missiles which can reach Berlin, Warsaw, and within 6 to 9 months, Berlin. So we face a really serious security problem in Europe, and I don't think we can get rid of it by shutting our eyes and pretending it's not there. Now I'm going to finish up with why we in Britain should mind about that, because Peter finished up his excellent Spectator article. Can anyone explain to me precisely why Britain, of all countries, should be siding with the expansion of the European Union and NATO into this dangerous and unstable part of the world? Well, I would say, first of all, the expansion of the European Union and NATO has made a lot of this world less dangerous, because at least it has provided a security structure in which arguments between these countries in the region don't necessarily go back the dark roads trodden during the 1930s. So things that worried us a lot in the 1990s, such as the rows between Hungary and Romania, Hungary and Slovakia, have been largely damped down. But most of all, I think the security order is worth defending because we in Britain benefit from it. We benefit very much, I would say particularly, from the economic security order of having the European Commission negotiating with Gazprom from a position of strength, rather than having individual countries negotiating with Gazprom from a position of weakness. The European Union is a $20 trillion economy. If you add North America, or sorry, Europe, yes, including Turkey, which both Peter and I have very dim views on Turkey, but even minus Turkey, it's an $18 trillion economy. Add in North America, and it's a nearly $40 trillion economy. It's 500 million people in Europe, and 300 million in North America. That's 800 million people and $40 trillion. And if we stick together, we can negotiate not just with the Russians, but also with the Chinese and others, from a position of strength. And if we don't, we can't. Because Russia is big, it's got natural resources, and it's got, although it's weak in some ways, it's got very strong willpower. And as Clausewitz said, if you have one party with great means and a weak will, and one party with strong will and weak means, the party with the strong will and weak means will triumph. And we face in Putin someone who has very strong will if he's still in charge, which of course we don't know because he hasn't been seen for a week, but whoever comes after him will be worse. And that's why I think this rule-based security, whether we're talking about military security or economic security or any other kind of security, is worth defending. Poland gets that. Poland is at the heart of Europe, it's at the heart of European decision-making, it's the heart of NATO decision-making. It's a very important country, it is one of the countries that NATO is most involved now in defending. So I think Poland's got it right. I just wish Britain would.
Good evening. A couple of opinion polls and surveys before I begin, if I may. First of all, if anybody here thinks that he has or she has an entirely open mind, will you please put your hands up? Good heavens, oh, there's Cambridge we realize. Now, secondly, I'm going to do a small quiz. How many times have Russian planes actually entered British airspace in the past year? 2? 0. Any? 3?
40 times.
No.
0.
Thank you. Right. Well, at least we're something to do with factual on that. I'm disappointed by the open minds there. Now, the last time I was in Poland, I wasn't in Poland because I was in Brest-Litovsk, as it isn't, I don't think, currently known, which is currently in Belarus, but which was in Poland, and may one day be in Poland again. But I think this illustrates to some extent the difficulty of the area which we're dealing with. When in the early years of the century, if you walk past the Polish embassy in Berlin, in what was now United Berlin on Unter den Linden, they used to display very prominently in their windows a series of pictures of the joint victory parades which Germany and the Soviet Union had mounted in Brest-Litovsk, in Pinsk and in Grodno, to illustrate a point which I think they felt it necessary to make to those many people in Europe who tend to think that the pivot of European history is somewhere around about Flanders or the English Channel, and are completely unaware of these enormous events which have taken place and which are actually at the keys to both, in fact, all three of the major conflicts, 2 hot, 1 cold, which have overtaken our continent in the past century. Poland is immensely important for that reason, because of where it is, and because of where it is now. It is extremely important in this particular discussion, which is fundamentally a discussion about where we should stand, if at all, on a conflict between the new modern German Empire and the post-Soviet Russian Empire. It is true, as Edward said, that I do take this attitude towards the European Union, but it is the continuation of Germany by other means. It is a continuation of Germany by people who understand that there are some things which you should not do, and which are now historically almost certainly banned, And it's also an understanding that it's much more effective if you want to obtain the hegemony which you wish to have, to do so by subtle and indeed benevolent means than by aggressive and violent ones. Nonetheless, you can see in the expansion of the European Union extraordinary traces of the activities of the German Empire in its final liberal phase, under particularly Richard von Kuhlmann, in 1917 and 1918, when Kuhlmann, and this is brilliantly described in a book which everybody in this room probably has read and should read if they haven't, Adam Tooze's The Deluge, by far the best book about the First World War that has been written, in which he explores the way in which Germany examined this very, very important thing, that there is not an absolute choice between sovereignty and slavery. That nations can exist in a liberal empire, in a modern liberal empire, in a different form of hegemony, with limited and conditional sovereignty, but nonetheless be under the ultimate control of that empire. And it was on that basis that they placed, as Tooze puts it, dynamite under the Russian Empire by deciding right back in 1917 to pursue the idea of national self-determination in the areas of Eastern and Central Europe which they wished themselves to dominate and take from Russia. And the first intimation of this was, of course, the creation of the phony Kingdom of Poland, which the Kaiser announced, and the proclamation of liberation rather than conquest, which German troops would make when they arrived subsequently to this proclamation in areas of Poland which they conquered from Russia. This simple, basic grasp of two things. One, you can have an empire in which the nations are allowed all kinds of trappings of nationhood, but fundamentally power belongs elsewhere. And secondly, that you can destroy one empire by encouraging people to believe that they can leave it and have national self-determination when in fact they will be joining yours. And if you actually examine this process in 1917-18 and see where it ended at the two pieces of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, one of which created modern Ukraine for the first time, you can see the foreshadowing of what we now have, quite accurately, it seems to me, and one which I think most people would look at and say, actually not a particularly foolish way of dividing up Europe, if Europe must be divided up. Russia exists. It is bound to exist. To remove it from politics or the map would be like trying to shift the Himalayas with a teaspoon. It will always be there. Germany exists in the same way and will likewise always be there, and therefore some sort of sensible compromise has to be found between these two empires in a civilized, liberal way in which nations are allowed to exist as freely as they reasonably can, though it just so happens that most of the nations in the European Union do not possess borders, do not possess control over their own economies, do not control their foreign policy, and do not control their defense policy. Now, this new liberal empire, under one guise or another, has, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, expanded by 400,000 square miles. In the same period, and this is only in the European region, I'm not at all dealing with Central Asia here, which is a separate question, what used to be the Soviet Union and is now Russia, has shrunk by 700,000 square miles. In between lies 300,000 square miles as yet in a neutral state. Most of it is in Ukraine, some of it is in Belarus. And it is over those 230,000 square miles that Europe is currently divided. Now, why is it that we should, looking at this, be anxious that it should go one way or the other? Why isn't it more sensible for us, as it would seem to me, to say, what we really need to avoid most of all in this area is a serious military conflict, or a conflict just short of war, in which people die, as they're doing at the moment, in quite large numbers, under shell fire and rocket fire, and all kinds of other unpleasant things. Why is it that we would not want there to be a peaceful solution? Why is it that we would, examining the needs and desires of the countries in that area, whatever we think of their internal regimes, why is it that we would ignore the protests of Russia, repeatedly made, that it regards attempts to compromise the neutrality of Ukraine and turn it into a member of the European Union bloc as a menace to its security and ultimately a menace to its sovereignty? Why would we ignore those again and again? Not merely ignore them. Why would that master of modern diplomacy, that Prince of Peace, George W. Bush, have in March 2008 gone to Bucharest and announced that he proposed to include Ukraine and Georgia in NATO? So the horror, even of Germany and France, who actually had to restrain them from going any further. Why have we behaved in this fashion? Why did the United States cancel the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally? thus telling Russia that it basically didn't care a damn about what it thought anymore. Why did Mr. Bush for many years pursue the installation of missiles in Central Europe? Missiles which had no purpose other than to threaten what remained of Russia. Why, over and over and over again, have Russian concerns over this matter been simply dismissed? And why is the answer always, actually, Russia is such a horrible tyranny, and people behave there so badly that we can't act rationally toward it? This is ridiculously inconsistent. One of the principal members of NATO is Turkey. The Turkish government under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a man who's actually said that he regards democracy as a tram, which you ride as far as you can, and then you go off, and who currently holds 800 journalists in prison, and who is, I think, almost certainly, has just constructed a palace of, I think, 1,000 rooms, with a laboratory in it for a food taster to so himself being poisoned in Ankara. We don't in any way worry ourselves about the ludicrousness and indeed oppression of this regime because he's a NATO ally. Well, indeed, not merely that. In 1974, Turkey seized, as a result of a putsch, the territory of North Cyprus. And in an event almost entirely parallel to the seizure of Crimea by Russia. And we've made no serious effort to eject Turkey from Northern Cyprus, where it still remains. What is it now, 41 years later? So we can't really persuade ourselves, I don't think, that we're dealing here with a reasoned argument for working ourselves up into a state of war with Russia. What we need to do, it seems to me, is to examine the history and geography and indeed the mathematics of Central Europe, to think primarily, as we always should, of the fate of the peoples of Central Europe, which Edward and I both observed before the end of the Cold War and during the post-Cold War period, and know perfectly well what they have escaped from, and also know perfectly well what it is that they might face if that area was once again subjected to war. Yet all we have is irresponsible talk of a new Cold War, unthinking talk of Russia as an aggressor when it is demonstrably not so, unthinking talk of Putin as Hitler, described as Hitler, a historical illiteracy, not merely by the Prince of Wales, who can be excused for historical illiteracy, I suppose, but by Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State of the United States. The level of this discussion has been extraordinarily low, and it needs to be raised, not least because I don't think any of us, if war came, would relish it or benefit from it, and least of all the peoples of Central Europe who have just been liberated from half a century of misery. Welcome it if it came. We should be so much more careful what we say.
Well, I'd like to come back, particularly Peter just had a marvellous final sentence about the peoples of Central Europe have been liberated. And I think there's a certain inconsistency in that, because with his opening point, which was that Russia had given up territory and the European Union had gained it. Because I think that's part of the fundamental disagreement we have here, that I see countries, not territory, and I see countries that make choices. And I'm not saying that every country that wants to join the European Union, or indeed NATO, should be allowed to do so. Certainly not immediately. But I don't think that it's right to say that the European Union, that Russia gave up territory, any more than it would be right to say that Germany in 1945 gave up territory in Poland. There was a very sharp geopolitical change with the end of the Soviet Union. A new country came up called Russia, based on the Russian Federation, which was a constituent part of the Soviet Union, which did not have, I think, an automatic right to rule or legacy over other victims of communism. Russia was a victim of communism as well. Now, it's true that under Putin, a new narrative has emerged in which the collapse of the Soviet Union is not seen as a liberation, but as a geopolitical catastrophe. But I don't think either Peter or I think that the collapse of the Soviet Union is a geopolitical catastrophe. Certainly for me, it was one of the happiest moments of my life, and something I spent most of the 1980s, and indeed even little of the 1970s, working towards. I think that Russia is, it's hard to argue that Russia is not an aggressor. I can argue why Russia is an aggressor. You can argue, which I think is wrong, and I would agree with Peter that the debate is at a very low level. Well, I'd be interested to know when the point was in the past when we had a debate at a high level. It seems to me that the debate is no more at a low level on this than it is on everything else. But I think that Russia is doing this because it sees Western weakness. It thinks the West is divided and decadent. It doesn't like the idea of a rules-based international order where the rules were set at a time when it was weak. And it sees a really good chance to change things. It sees a chance to bust the EU as a rule-setting body in the field of energy policy, which is very important to it. It sees a chance to divide the European Union and America, because America is under a kind of post-Atlanticist president, and the European Union, in many respects, is the most anti-American it's ever been. And Putin has said publicly he thinks that the Atlantic Alliance should be history. So this is very good. If you can make the Europeans give up on America, and the Americans give up on Europe, and we don't have the American security guarantee, that hugely increases Russia's leverage in Europe. He's also, I think, using this new, and it is a new narrative, it's not something that was part of the official Russian position in the 1990s, at least openly, and it wasn't something that they said for most of Putin's first 8 years in office, this idea of Western encirclement and betrayal, because it distracts from the failure of Putin's political and economic experiment, which has been colossal. After 15 years of Putinism, we've seen more than $1 trillion disappear from Russia, most of it, I'm ashamed to say, through the City of London and into the London property market and other places, and also through offshore centres such as Jersey and Guernsey and British Virgin Islands, which this country is also responsible. But we haven't seen the kind of modernisation of Russia that Russia is the real Russophiles had hoped for. We've seen an enormous looting frenzy, and Russians are a bit fed up with that. And if you look at... Yeah, sure.
Before I forget how you began. First of all, the point about who. It is forgotten now because many people didn't even live through it. But the ending of the Soviet Union did not need to be as it was. There were many people in the Soviet Union who would have preferred to resist and to keep it going. And those people, I was in Moscow, in fact, the day when the tanks came up my street, to Street Prospect in August 1991, when those people, led by Vladimir Khrushchev of the KGB, and a very sinister man called Boris Putin, who I think shot himself twice after it failed. Yes, in mysterious circumstances. These people did indeed hope to keep the Soviet Union together by force. And these people were, in my view, entirely capable of having 1, 2, 3, 20 Tiananmen squares to keep it going, and would have done so. And on occasion they showed their teeth. It was the terrible time in Tbilisi when demonstrators were hacked to death with sharpened shovels by special forces troops. There was the occasion in Vilnius in January 1991, which I witnessed when the KGB squad opened fire on the television station among crowds surrounding it, and lied afterwards that those who were dead were victims of traffic accidents. It's rare for victims of traffic accidents have backs of their heads missing, but that's what they said. This sort of thing was going on. People wanted to do it, and in the end, because of Gorbachev and Manu, I think, has faded too much into the background, was given too little credit. Because of Gorbachev, it did not happen. The Soviet Union did voluntarily relinquish power, did voluntarily destroy the authority of the Communist Party. I remember, again, the afternoon, the evening when the Communist Party was forced by Gorbachev to relinquish its leading role in the state. An amazing moment, the final reversal of the Leninist putsch of 1917, and in some ways, perhaps the most enjoyable moment of my entire time in Moscow, because it was actually completely peaceful and without resistance. There was and we boast in this country, it might be wrongly, especially given what happened in India, of the peaceful and civilized way in which we withdrew from our empire in the 1940s. I think the Russians can boast probably rather more of having peacefully abandoned an empire in the 1980s and 1990s. I think we should be pleased about that. The position of the nations left afterwards, these refugee nations impoverished by years of communism, was very difficult. And indeed, the initial reaction of the European Union to them was, thank you very much, we don't want to buy your tomatoes, clear off, we're not interested. And in fact, most of them joined NATO as a consolation prize. We won't buy your tomatoes so you can have our nuclear apparatus instead.
So which countries?
I can't remember the actual sequence. But
three. Poles, Czechs and Hungarians joined NATO before the...
Well, that's quite a significant bunch of countries, isn't it?
I don't recall there being much discussion about tomatoes at the time.
It's, it is, I think, a fair summary of the position. They were given NATO members consolation prize. And if you read Richard Sackwell's excellent book, Frontline Ukraine, recently released, he doesn't recently released, it does make this point rather well, that NATO, by expanding into these areas, created the very tension which it now proposes to defend you against. If it had not done so, that would not happen. So I think we have to look here at several mistaken actions taken by our side, and also not to forget the actual, I don't want to call it generosity, because I think that would probably be going too far, but undoubtedly how shall I put this? The fact that what happened did not need to happen, could have happened otherwise, could have been 1,000 times worse, and there were people in Russia working very hard, not just in Russia, I have to say, but in other parts of the Communist Europe, working very hard to avoid the dreadful carnage which resistance to that collapse would have caused. They deserve more credit for that than they get, just as Russia in general deserves more consideration as a country with national pride than it gets. And part of the reason for my taking my position, and Ed said that he wanted to know what was it, why Russia was menacing Sweden. I'm not a spokesman for the Kremlin. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, won't even speak to me because I called him a sinister tyrant. I have no idea why Russia has been menacing Sweden. What I am is I hope, a spokesman for truth and balance in this extraordinary discussion. That is what I wish to defend. And you also said, when is debate ever high? I don't know, sometimes I think it's higher than now, but one thing this debate reminds me of very greatly is that dreadful period before the Iraq War, when people genuinely believed, they deny it now, they genuinely believed that Saddam was Hitler, they genuinely believed in the weapons of mass destruction. They allowed themselves to be fooled by exactly the same people, in many cases, as we're trying to fool us now about Russia.
It's interesting, one of the great architects of the push into Iraq was Peter Mandelson, the sinister Svengali, I think one can say without being libelous, of the Blair Court, or as you put it, Blair Creature's Court. And I don't see, and what's also interesting now is that Mandelson was one of the great leaders of the, I hesitate to call it appeasement, because I agree with you, that's historically illiterate. But one of the remarkable things to me is the breadth and depth of the pro-Putin lobby in Europe. You have business figures, really the pinstriped accomplices of the Russian, politely, engagement in the City of London, and a whole phalanx of people, whether they're in the energy business or they're PR people and all sorts of other corporate titans who just like the fact that they can feast at the Kremlin trough. You've also got George Galloway, the kind of the hard left. You've got the people on the right, like Nigel Farage and others, who say we wish that our leaders stuck up for our country the way that Putin sticks up for his. So I'm not sure that the Iraq War parallel is quite correct. I think there's a lot more resistance to standing up to Putin now than there was in that particular black period of British diplomacy. I want to come back to the issue of what Putin wants, because Peter talks about national pride, and it seems to me that we should be, everybody in this room would be happy if Russia was a strong, independent, stable, prosperous country that we could do business with and trade with and negotiate with, a country that would have its interests which we wouldn't like, just as every other country has interests that we don't like. There's quite a lot about France that we don't like, and we have to negotiate with them over fishing and the electricity and gas interconnectors, and there's worries that Germans don't like what France is doing. There's a whole range of national interests which are now, I think, much more satisfactorily dealt with in the framework of the European Union than they are through bilateral diplomacy. But I think that where I disagree with Peter on the historical illiteracy is that I do think that Putin's compatriot policy has very direct echoes of Adolf Hitler's approach to the Germans who were stranded by the collapse of the German Empire. And if you look at Putin's speech from almost exactly a year ago this year, The overlap in rhetoric is absolutely remarkable. He says Sartetisfeliki in exactly the way that Putin talks about the that Hitler talked about the Volksgenossen. And the idea that being a German speaker is a political category is, I think, as sinister and dangerous as the idea that a Russian speaker is a political category. Peter and I both speak Russian. Your accent is excellent. Mine is terrible. Maybe
my vocabulary and my grammar are
well, between us, we make quite a good.
We almost make half a Russian.
But this is not a political category, and any more than English speaker is a political category. And the way that Putin has elevated compatriot to a political category and claimed for Russia the right to intervene, indeed intervene militarily, in other countries in order to protect Russian speakers is, I think, a profound challenge and one that must be absolutely resisted, because what happens if that becomes the new rule? Where does it stop? How many other countries can intervene across the border in other countries in order to protect what I suppose in English we'd probably sort of not say compatriots, we'd say the kith and kin, which is an argument that was sometimes made by Britain in the 50s and 60s. So I think there is I don't have any difficulty in explaining what Russia's doing. My argument fits all the facts at the moment. I would argue this predates Putin. It started actually back in the early 90s. There's an amazing piece by a guy called Victor Yasmin, who wrote about Eurasianism. It was published in 93, but it was actually researched in 92. And a lot of what he says about this sinister cocktail of autocracy, nationalism, Soviet nostalgia, is, if he'd written it in 2002, it would have been impressive. The fact he wrote it in 1992 is absolutely amazing. Yes, finally, very briefly, and then you can say something, and then everyone else can say. Leonard Meri, the Estonian president, gave a speech in 1994 in Hamburg, where he warned that Russia had not stepped over its imperial shadow, that Russia wanted to regain its national pride at the expense of other countries, that Russia was not willing to settle its differences with other countries through diplomacy, and was saying so publicly. Interestingly, the Russian delegation at this meeting in Hamburg got up and walked out. One of them was the grey and unmemorable official from St. Petersburg called Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So we were warned a long time ago about this. We were warned by the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, people like Václav Havel, Poles, others warned us. And we in the West didn't listen. We ignored them, we patronised them, we belittled them. And they've been right. The Poles and others have been right. We didn't listen, and that's why we're in the mess we're in now.
I think this might be a good moment. I don't know whether you wanted to take a chair as well for this. If we open it up to questions now from the floor. One small, no, I'll leave it. I'll respond in my answer. But one small plea: if you could make sure that your questions are questions, that would be helpful, because then we can answer them. If they're not questions, we can't answer them.
Sure. Introduce yourself briefly. Okay, I'm Julius. I'm with the Faculty of Law at this university. I have a question to Edward. You've mentioned on several occasions that the international legal order, the right of self-determination, and all these principles. And at the same time, you said that Poland got it all right in the last 25 years or so. Do you include in that statement Poland's activities in the Iraq War of 2003? And do you include in that statement the secret CIA prisons in Poland?
Let's take several questions.
Oh no, please. That's a horrible playwright thing. Let's do them one at a time. Thank you.
I think that Poland saw. Poland believed that if it was going to be defended, it had to be an active part of the International Security Alliance. And it played that very vigorously. There was an immensely impressive Polish operation in the early 90s. I think actually the first Iraq War, to get trapped the Polish Secret Service and Special Forces smuggled some Americans who were caught in Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait the first time around. And they got them out, and America was very grateful for that. Poland, for historical reasons, knows Iraq very well. There's a lot of Poles who speak Arabic. A lot of Poles have been there during the 70s and 80s on communist-sponsored construction projects. Poland was a very useful ally. I think that, in retrospect, no country, even the Americans, don't think the Iraq War was a good idea. But I think for Poland at the time to play as active a role as it could in the #1 security priority for the Americans was really the only thing to do. On the secret prisons, I think they were wrong. It was very interesting. The Americans came to all their allies and said, will you help us with rendition? And this was at a time of enormous tension and worry, and we didn't know if there was going to be another 9/11. And I'm not passing immediate judgment whether they, on the exact rights and wrongs of it. But it was very interesting. They said to the Poles were already in NATO, but they said to the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, if you do this for us, we will put you in NATO, and if you don't, we won't. And the Lithuanians cracked, and they said, okay, we'll do it. And the Estonians and Latvians said, sorry, we have such memories of deportations and secrecy and so on, we just can't do it. They also said privately, or we also, even if we were willing to do it, we don't think that you would keep it a secret, and then we'll be the ones there on our face. And I think that was in retrospect, that was very accurate, because although America is a wonderful country in many ways, it has an appalling habit of spilling other people's secrets for political advantage, and I think that that's been a very painful learning experience for the British government.
I very much enjoyed your question.
My name is Davide. I'm a second-year history student. Sorry. I have a couple of questions for Ms. Hitchens. The first one being possibly flattering. I'm trying to compare you to the Prince of Wales in the historically illiterate. And I was wondering how you could describe the European Union as a German empire and Germany as having already always existed when Germany is the creation of the 19th century and when it was considered the sixth man of Europe in 2000, not any earlier than 2000. Whereas the European Union has been around since, well, depends how you date it, but it could be the Treaty of Rome in 1957 or it could be a little later. And the second question relates to the Russian side of your argument. I was very intrigued by hearing Belarus being described as a neutral territory, whereas places like Hungary would be described as part of the new German Empire. So Hungary clearly does not follow German policies, at least to my knowledge, and Belarus seems to follow Russian policies a little more closely.
Right, well, I guess it is true that we do owe to Napoleon Bonaparte the modern unification of Germany, but I think it would be reasonable to say that the large number of small states which existed before Bonaparte created them as a military and political unity was still Germany. To the extent that Hungary diverges, I suppose, diverges, to the extent that Belarus diverges, it diverges. They still nonetheless are both of them subject to the economic and political systems of their great neighbours, and I think it's nitpicking to suggest that they're not.
Can I just say on this business of Germany's role in the EU? For years, the EU was a partnership between France and Germany. Basically, France and Germany did deals, and then it was the Commission's job to carry them out. And the Germans like that. And one of the things that most bothers the Germans now is that they are disproportionately strong. They need France to be successful. It really worries them that France is not successful. It terrifies them that Marine Le Pen might become president of France. It really bothers them that Italy is unsuccessful. They don't want to be the one horse pulling the wagon. And I think that Germany has realised that its national interest is best served by not pushing its national interest all the time. But I don't think that's part of a sort of subtle plot. I think that's because they realise that they will do best with a very large single market inside Europe, which can then negotiate with countries like China for a position of great strength. And they will do better in that than if they go the national Sonderweg. And they're prepared to eat quite a lot of lumps as a result. They're prepared to pay for the whole thing, and they're prepared to be outvoted and for things to happen that they don't like. They didn't at all like, for example, the EU's energy policy, which has led to the destruction of some of the biggest energy companies in Germany, which have, were very dependent on the old gas import model, and are now companies like Royal Gas are in trouble now. That was actually pushed through, interestingly, by a German commissioner as well. But they're prepared to suck it up because they think the overall idea of having a successful Europe is bigger. Unfortunately, we don't have a very successful Europe at the moment, but that's not Germany's fault.
Well, if we're going to that, we should also add that Germany gains immensely by having the devaluation of the Deutschmark through the euro, which enables it to trade in the world. If Japan could contrive a device for pushing the value of the yen down as much as the euro pushes the value of the Deutschmark down, it certainly would, but it can't. Germany gains enormously economically, but of course it's prepared to pay some price, just as Britain was prepared to pay heavy prices quite often for its empire. It's prepared to pay a price for it. One of those prices is, of course, not to boast too much about being top nation, but the fact remains that it is.
So, I have another question to Mr. Hitchens. I'm sorry that you get so many questions in a row, but you have asked why have we ignored Russian objections to Ukraine's association with the European Union, even though Russians have warned that they would consider it as a threat to their interests. Well, my question to you is, why do you think they have any legitimate thing to say about it? Why do you think we should take their objections into account? Why do you think they have the right to decide what political futures their neighbors choose?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think if we had, for instance, either in Mexico or in Canada, the countries signing economic, political, and military agreements with Russia, you would find pretty rapidly the United States intervening in Mexico and Canada, because no country is with long land borders, long vulnerable land borders, is prepared to tolerate on its frontier the possibility of the stationing of hostile troops within 100 miles of its major cities, and they would not do it. And the great good fortune of the United States is that it actually has countries on its borders which don't do this kind of thing, though Cuba, which is the closest, being 90 miles away, did suffer the invasion of the Bay of Pigs as a result of joining the Russian alliance. It's a simple matter of fact. One of the things I do know about Russian is one of the central words, of course, when I was in the Soviet Union, was the word for security, as the central word of Komitets Государственной безопасности. Безопасность is the word for security. It is a negative word. It means without danger, an absence of danger, because there is no, and I checked this with Russian friends, there is no positive word for security in Russia. This is because it is a country which has ceaselessly been invaded by the Mongols. There's a street in southern Moscow called Bolsha-Ordinka, and it is so called because it is the street that the Golden Horde used to turn up every 5 years to collect their tribute. Moscow has been invaded by Poles, Moscow has been invaded by the French, and Moscow has been very nearly invaded by Germans. It is an extremely vulnerable country with no natural defensible frontiers, and therefore it objects quite reasonably if people move hostile alliances right up to its frontiers. Britain and America being countries entirely surrounded by water, and in our case until recently defended by powerful navies, have not had this problem, and so lack imagination indeed with other countries which have this problem. But those of us who do have imagination can surely see that there is a problem here. The association agreement was not a trade deal. If you read Title 2, Article 7, you will find quite clearly that it contains military and political provisions, and it was intended to do so and was understood as such. It was also, by its nature, bound to disrupt existing trade arrangements between Ukraine and Russia. And indeed, the people of Ukraine are going to find out as the IMF, its so-called rescue plan, kicks in towards the end of this year and into next year. It's also going to contain very, very powerful changes in their lives, immense increases in energy prices, cuts in pensions, cuts in public sector employees, destruction of native industries, is all going to happen. Now, I think it seems reasonable, especially given that large numbers of people in Ukraine, especially before the departure of Crimea and its seizure by Russia, very large numbers of people in Ukraine were not particularly happy with the westward drive of the more militant nationalists, that this was going to be a problem for Russia. And it duly was. And to provoke it was to risk trouble. Ever since Bucharest in 2008, it's been extremely tense. After George Bush was frustrated in getting his way of putting Ukraine and Georgia onto the path of NATO membership in 2008, somehow or other, a war was provoked in Georgia. The Tagliavini report says quite definitely it was provoked by Mikhail Saakashvili, and that is a neutral report by a Swiss person under I think, the United Nations or EU auspices, I'm never going to remember. But there's no question that war was started by Georgia. And during the course of that war, the then president of Ukraine, Mr. Yushchenko, traveled to Tbilisi and there announced that the Russian base in Sevastopol, one of their most vital military installations, would not remain under Russian control beyond 2017. Now these repeated threats, military, political and economic, to a large and powerful country, were not wise things to do. Unless what we seriously intend to do is to destroy Russia as a country, militarily, economically and politically, and
I think that the EU association agreement is fundamentally about modernisation. Ukrainians were right to want it. They want the same liberty, legality, decency and dignity which we enjoy here in this country, which thanks to the changes of the last 25 years, Poles and Estonians and Latvians, Lithuanians and Czechs and Slovaks and others enjoy as well. And I think that's a natural and laudable aspiration. Ukraine has been the most mismanaged country, I think, in Europe, probably even worse than Moldova, since 1991, with a systematic, dreadful failure by the political class to build a modern state. I think it's quite reasonable in those circumstances for Ukrainians to say, we, rather as Italians, are very enthusiastic Europeans, we need some kind of external framework. Let's put the acquis into Ukraine, and this sets a kind of standard, and all the progress that we'll have to make towards EU membership, even if we never actually get there, will have a beneficial effect on our own countries.
That's not what it was about. The people of Ukraine tolerated for years the corruption and mismanagement of their government. They still hate it. And indeed, the people who are now in power are exactly the same people who mismanaged the country before. By name, they are the same people.
You mean the Georgians, the Lithuanians?
The same oligarchs, the same, nothing strange. Also this strange belief that association with, let alone membership of the European Union, waves magic wand over the country. The European Union arrives, corruption into the past, mismanagement, inefficiency, poverty, vanish. Well, go tell the Romanians and the Bulgarians that.
And the
go tell the Croatians who've actually gone backwards economically since they joined the European Union. There is no magic effect of EU membership on a country. If a country is as disastrous as Ukraine, even EU membership, assuming EU membership does have magic effects, even EU membership, which has blighted this country, even EU membership cannot necessarily solve your problems. And the issue in the Maidan in February 2014 wasn't about corruption and it wasn't about democracy. In fact, those who say it was about democracy are committing a very grave linguistic crime. It was about neutrality and it was about power. And the reason why the crowds were on the Maidan was not because they suddenly discovered that the country was corrupt and mismanaged. They'd known that all along. It was because the issue of the association agreement was an issue of power. Who controlled Ukraine? Was Ukraine to be neutral or was Ukraine to be aligned? And the result of it was that Ukraine became aligned.
Peter, what actually really stoked Maidan was the meeting between Yanukovych and Putin, where Yanukovych said he was going to sign the Eurasian Economic Union Agreement in exchange for a whacking great bribe. And that really incensed people. What also incensed them was the fact they were being shot. But I think we're not here to talk specifically about Ukraine. I wonder, is anyone actually here from Ukraine? I'd love to hear from some Ukrainians what they think, because or even perhaps some more Poles. I feel I didn't argue that the European Union waves the magic wand. Far from it. I said right at the beginning, I think it makes terrible mistakes, and I think there are respects in which countries have joined the EU had to go backwards as a result. But I think that if you are looking for some way out of the ghastly swamp that Ukraine found itself in, the Ukrainians found themselves in after 25 years, with the enormous failure of the Orange Revolution in 2005 to bring that to change, that the EU acts as a kind of magnetic west. It was something to aspire to, and you could say that we clearly can't do it on our own. We don't want to be like Russia. We would like to be like the West. And getting as close as we can to the EU and copying as many of the things of the EU as we can is the best choice out of some pretty, well, the others are pretty bad.
But this is cargo cult. It doesn't actually mean anything. The European Union doesn't have any money anymore. It's debauching its own currency to try and survive. It has terrible problems in Greece and in Spain. Mass unemployment. Even Poland, the miracle country, which is currently undergoing a larger aid program than the Marshall Plan by some considerable size, even Poland has very large-scale unemployment, quite low incomes, and millions of people have to leave the country to find work. How is the European Union, and Poland, remember, Poland had not actually been subject to the Soviet Union since 1917. It had had a long period before Soviet takeover to develop as an economy of society. The idea that Ukraine can somehow, by this bankrupt body, the European Union, be transformed into a modern economy is fanciful. It it doesn't exist. This opportunity doesn't exist. The European Union can't even save Ireland or Portugal. How would it save Ukraine? It's an absurdity. So why don't we accept that this is about power? Because that is what it is about. Otherwise, why were there political and military clauses in the association agreement?
We had a question at the back of the room.
Hello, for the talk. I'm a fellow in economics. I'm interested in this anti-Russian narrative. I'm not Russian, so I'm not taking any personal comment on that. But so you mentioned the number of journalists in the USA being in Russia,
Turkey.
being
Turkey.
in Turkey,
800 in Turkey.
and 800 in Turkey. What is the number in context in the USA? And let's not forget about the whole Guantanamo Bay stuff. Then there's the Snowden problem. You mentioned USA and EU joining together against Russia in terms of creating security through NATO and so on. But what is it that makes United States any less dangerous of a country than Russia, given that USA has been involved, if not the cause of most recent wars, at least in my lifetime, in the Middle East, Iraq, and so on and so forth. They have a huge number of prisoners, journalists in prison. They've got the Snowden scandal very recently. And let's not forget the Hiroshima effect, of course. So they're the ones, while Russia might be a nuclear threat, they actually have used the nuclear bomb in Japan. So what is it that in this unification of EU and US and others against Russia makes USA any less of a threat than Russia and any less dangerous? Thank you.
Do you want to do that one?
I think it's directed to you, Peter, but why don't you answer it first?
I don't know who these hundreds of journalists are who are in prison in the United States. It's news to me. I'm very critical of a lot of what the United States does, but I don't believe that imprisoning journalists is one of its faults. One of our problems is the continued existence in the State Department of the Wolfowitz doctrine that there should be no rival hegemon to the United States in any area, and such must be challenged. But that's a matter of foreign policy and what great powers sometimes do. I think it's a mistaken policy by the United States. But the United States, by comparison with Russia, is without doubt a law-governed democracy with a free press and many, many things which make it far superior to Russia, despite all its many faults. Not least still the terrible legacy of slavery, which we see more results of even today. But to make an equivalence between the United States and Russia, I think would be mistaken. The question here is not whether Russia and the United States are the same. The question here is whether we actually should pursue a policy against Russia, which is largely based on repeatedly telling voters that Russia is such a bad country that all measures against it are justified. And this seems to me to be a grave mistake and has nothing to do with serious foreign policy.
I must have missed the political consensus that says we have to get defence spending up to 2% to deal with Russia. It seemed to me we have political consensus that we're not going to get defence spending up to 2% in order to deal with Russia. And there seems to me to be a political consensus in Europe that we should impose the weakest possible sanctions for the shortest possible period of time. Mrs. Merkel makes the best effort she can to push back against that, but she is in a minority. I think on the moral equivalence between America and Russia, the simplest way to look at it is to say there's really two kinds of countries in the world, and I don't like talking about democracy because it's such a kind of wet, floppy term, and North Korea tends to be democratic. The very basic question you have to ask yourself is this a country where you can sue the government and win? Or is it a country where if you sue the government and you'll certainly lose and probably end up in prison? And America is a country where you can sue the government and win, and people sue the government on a regular basis at state and federal level, and they win. Russia is a country where you cannot sue the government sues you and you go to jail. And that's a very, very fundamental difference between the Russian system and ours.
Where do you put Ukraine on this scale?
I think Ukraine is in a terrible mess. It has been in a terrible mess. It got worse under Yanukovych, a lot worse, which is one of the reasons that the Maidan, which you refer to as a mob, which I would perhaps furthermore neutral protesters, it was one of the things they were most annoyed about was that Yanukovych was using the legal system to enrich himself. He was creating, in a very, actually Russian, rather like this Russian idea of an corporate raiding. He was using the legal system to seize companies from their owners and bring them into his family, and also incidentally laundering the money in the West. And it's mysterious that none of that has been returned so far. So I think that Ukraine has come through that in a triple crisis: a financial economic crisis, which you mentioned, a sort of legal, constitutional, political crisis where no state institutions work properly, and a massive security crisis where they're effectively at war with a much larger and more powerful neighbour without the means to defend themselves, let alone to win. And any one of those crises would be awful, and all three are combined. And I think for that reason we have to have extremely modest expectations about Ukraine. I don't at all. And I think in the best possible case, we're able to deter Russia from further aggression, freeze the conflict along the current line of hostilities, and then maybe, if we're very lucky, over 10 or 15 years, make a political and economic success story of what's left. That's the only good outcome, and all the others are worse.
Question at the side here.
Justina, Faculty of Education. I have a question to Mr. Edward Lucas. Edward, I saw you retweeting Bloomberg, and so hopefully my question is not too straightforward, and not outdated, but where is Putin, and what could be the political consequences of such assessments of his disappearance from public life? Thank you.
Very briefly, he's either had a sort of mini nervous breakdown, which he seemed to have in the past with the Kursk sinking and the Beslan tragedy. So he's got 4 moments of great political stress, he disappears. There's been a lot of talk about his health, so maybe he's genuinely, maybe he's physically ill, because with mental illness is a genuine illness as well. It could be he's had a stroke or something like that. There's clearly something very odd going on in the Kremlin power structures at the moment, and it's interesting that nobody seems to know why. The most plausible explanation I've heard is there's a fundamental fight going on between the FSB and the Chechens, and that the murder of Nemtsov was done by the FSB in order to show the Chechens who's boss, or possibly done by the Chechens to show the FSB who's boss. But either way, Putin didn't know about it, and he's very upset and afraid that he may be next. But I think honestly, you could write a novel about this, and the plot would be just as likely to be right as anything you read in the newspapers.
So this is a question to Mr. Peter Hitchens. My name is Tom. I'm a PhD student in economics from Poland. If you believe that the Maidan was about power, I wonder and if there was an understanding in the Ukrainian population that political class is unreformable and corrupt, what was the power motive that drove hundreds of thousands of middle-class Ukrainians to go out into the streets in Kiev? I believe that the moment, and maybe our Ukrainian listener will sort of clarify this, but I thought that the moment that the masses did go out onto the streets in Kiev was when the security services in Kiev decided to beat up students who set up camp in the main square. So that was
well, I'm a former Trotskyist, and I can tell you it takes a lot of organisation to get a spontaneous demonstration. And when I see people camping out on snow-covered concrete and asphalt squares in the centre of major cities, I think somebody there knows what they're doing. Have you ever tried pitching a tent on concrete or on asphalt? It needs technique. Someone needs to feed these people. Someone needs to encourage them. Now, I don't know who it was, but I know that Victoria Nuland has said at some Stiftung in Washington, D.C. that the United States has spent $5 billion on encouraging what it calls democratic institutions in Ukraine over the past 10 years or so. And the European Union has spent 300 million euros on the same subject. So one has to always wonder also, shortly after these events took place, John Brennan, the director of the CIA, turned up in Kiev. He didn't mean to be discovered there, but he was. And I don't think he was there for the nightclubs. I have no doubt whatsoever that the GRU and the Russian special forces are deeply involved in both Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. It's ridiculous to pretend otherwise. But it's equally ridiculous to pretend that Western intelligence services have not been active on the other side. So spontaneous demonstrations are what they are. You can believe them if you like. The fact is, at the moment at which this spontaneous demonstration, which was of course based upon the Orange Revolution, its original begetter in terms of organisation and nature, the moment when it actually took off was the moment when Yanukovych said he wasn't going to sign the association agreement and seemed to be about to prefer the Russian offer, which actually was a rational decision because the Russian offer contained a great deal more money, far more money than was on offer from the European Union to a country which was broke. And it was not by any means an irrational decision to say, I'm holding off on this, I'll think we'll sign that. For people suddenly to discover that their country was corrupt and undemocratic at that moment seems to me to be a very, very interesting example of coincidence theory. If you want to believe that, you can. The next thing about the Maidan is this, that you will remember, of course, that after it had been going on for some time and had turned pretty nasty, several people, including Ladislav Sikorski and others from outside, came and made an agreement with Klitschko and several other leading members of the Ukrainian Democratic anti-Yanukovych side for an end to the violence under which Yanukovych would remain, but fresh elections would be held quickly and Yanukovych would agree to constitutional amendments. When this agreement was presented to the peaceful crowd in the Maidan, one of its leaders said, get out of here. We don't want Yanukovych here anymore, and if he's here by tomorrow morning, we will take to the streets with violence. And so all these Democrats who had thought they had a deal, instead of fighting for it, and speaking to the Maidan and going to the microphone and saying, we have a deal here, Yanukovych is going, let's have a constitutional end to this, they turned around and fled. And what happened next was that the Yanukovych government, which remember was a legitimately elected government, lawfully in power, fell under the pressure and fear of mob violence. And remember, this peaceful protest killed 20 police officers according to United Nations figures. And it didn't just kill people, it was extremely violent. Many of the demonstrators were armed. This was, quite straightforwardly, a putsch. And it was a putsch in which a mob was used to expel the legitimate government. Yanukovych was not removed democratically, he was not removed according to the Constitution. Clause 111 of the Ukrainian Constitution on the impeachment of the president was not observed. Insufficient votes were available in the Rada. Armed men were present in the chamber at the time the vote was taken, and the procedures were not followed. This was lawless. If you support it, you support lawlessness. You cannot call yourself a Democrat. It was a putsch. It was at least as much a putsch as the Bolshevik putsch in Petrograd in 1917, which was actually more peaceful.
I think there's a very big hole in this argument. The facts as you presented them would lead to that conclusion. But Yanukovych was presented with a deal which would have kept him in power until elections in December. And then, for reasons that nobody could understand, he ran away.
No, the reasons I've just told you, that when Klitschko and the others came before the crowd and said, this is the deal which we've made, the crowd held them down, rejected it, and said that if Yanukovych wasn't gone, there would be violence. And at about that time, at the same time, arsenals were being raided in western Ukraine, and it was known that the rebels had access to large quantities of arms.
Yanukovych had all the leaders. He had the entire Ukrainian army, he had the SBU, he had the Berkut, he had... If Yanukovych had wanted to stay in power after that deal, he could have done. The reason he ran away was because he knew that he had no chance of winning those elections in December. And if he did... hang on a minute. We can speculate about why...
Was a legitimate head of state overthrown by lawless violence?
I would say it's a bit like James II running away in this country in 1688. If a head of state who was...
There's no question about what happened that night.
There was, if your head of state has systematically trashed the constitution, grotesquely enriched himself, hollowed out every institution, used on repeated occasions, got his security forces to beat up and open fire people on protesters, has murdered his opponents, as well as beating up all sorts of people, including opposition journalists. And if after all that, he's then faced with a internationally brokered deal where he stays in power until December and chooses not to, and runs away to the mystification of the entire weight of the European Union was thrown behind making that deal happen. And if you watch the video clip of it at the time, Sikorski is saying to the demonstrators, accept this deal, otherwise you're all dead. Because
they didn't accept the deal.
They didn't accept the deal, but Yanukovych, well, some of them didn't accept the deal, but Yanukovych didn't, and nobody to this day understands why Yanukovych ran away. He had the support of the Russians and the European Union and the Americans were all behind this deal. He chose to run away.
But it doesn't matter. He was the constitutional head of state of Ukraine, and he was removed.
Bonnie Prince Charlie is still
Okay, we have a question here from Professor Mita.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, both Peter and Edward, for a very spirited debate. I just attended a major conference. Yeah, hi, Andrew Mita. I just took part in another government conference in the UK, then went to Warsaw and talked to some folks there as well. I hear a lot of buyer's remorse in these conversations, not so much in yours perhaps, but in a lot of European kind of debates on NATO enlargement. We should have not, we could have, what would have happened and whatnot. I would like to redirect the conversation, not so much to what we should have done, but what we can do in the current situation. Kind of get away from Ukraine, if you will. Get away from, is Russia good, bad, is Putin Hitler or not? These are to be strong. I want to talk about the security situation. The United States has a treaty-based obligation to the new members of the alliance. So does your country and presumably other members of the alliance as well. We have a situation where the Europeans now spend, on average, about 1.5% of your GDP in defense. 5 years ago, it was 2.3. Despite Wales, the trend is downward. British Army will be probably smaller than any time since 2 centuries. Your Air Force can fit in a soccer field. We can go through that. 9 years ago, I'm making a speech, but it's important. 9 years ago, Europe provided about 50% of NATO's capability. Today, it's about 70% US, 75 actually. Top range capabilities, Europe, blind, deaf. And I'm not saying this to be mean, I'm just saying what the reality is. We have treaty obligations to Baltic states. We have treaty obligations to Poland, which is presumably the subject of this conversation. What do we do if there's a crisis situation? If, in whatever scenario, Donbass scenario or whatever, Putin jumps the red line in the Baltics, for example, not a conventional attack, hybrid scenario, grabs some territory, sits there, ethnic turmoil in Marva or somewhere else, and waits for NATO to respond. Ilves, I presume, screams bloody murder, says this is Article 5, help me, and the discussion begins. The Portuguese say, I'm not so sure. The Poles say, I'm absolutely sure. The Germans say, no, not yet. Fielding us and Mitte and all this kind of stuff. What can we do and what are the consequences for the larger European security should such a scenario materialize? I think that's important. In other words, not what we should have done, what we could have done, what this or that means. What can we do if the bad thing happens?
Oh, my country has, in the past 110 years, first of all, destroyed its own empire, changed from being a creditor to a debtor nation, and ultimately bankrupted itself by making guarantees to people on the continent of Europe, which it had no intention of keeping and wasn't able to keep. The first one being that of Belgian neutrality, and the second one being Polish independence. It seems to me that we're on the verge of making the same mistake all over again. I don't think it's any business of my country what happens in that part of Europe. I don't believe we have any substantial material or other interests in it. I don't see that it's any concern of ours whether how exactly the balance runs between the European Union and Russia. I do think it's unwise to provoke trouble as we're doing at the moment, and if we do so indeed, the proportion of our GDP which will go on military matters will rise from 2% to about 60%, and then we will know what war is like. But that by then it will be too late. I just think we should recognise that when we're considering these guarantees that we're making, what are we guaranteeing and why are we guaranteeing it? What is it our concern that parts of the Russian Empire change to being in the German Empire and backwards as they do from time to time? Why should we be involved? I don't understand it. What is my interest? When the Soviet Union was an ideological state devoted around the globe to spreading the appalling idea of communism, when it had a global navy and immense strategic reach, when it menaced us all, then I was probably the most militant cold warrior you could find. When all my friends had CND banned the bomb stickers on their cars, I had a NATO sticker on my car. I knew what the Soviet Union was. I hated it. I wanted it to fall. I watched it fall. I know it fell. I know it doesn't exist anymore. I have no idea why NATO still exists, because it's an alliance against something which is gone. And I don't know why we're even talking like this. And the idea that we, a country which is actually so bankrupt that it can barely count the level of its bankruptcy, should be seriously considering embarking on a huge tranche of military spending for a war in Europe about a country in which we have no concern. I do not know. And if I can conceivably persuade people this is a bad idea, then I will.
So you're basically saying, if there's an Article 5 situation on the periphery, on the flank of NATO, do nothing.
Well, I would say NATO should have been dissolved at the end of the
So
Cold
isn't
War,
it-
and I think we should leave it now.
Is there anyone in the
What are we
room?
doing in it?
Is there anyone in the room from Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania? Okay, right. So you're saying to these people here that if they are attacked by Russia, we do nothing.
Well, I'm saying that we will do nothing. We might bluster now that we will do something, as we told the Belgians to do. Some Belgians spent the entire First World War under general occupation. We said to the Poles in 1939 that we would aid them. We didn't send so much as a parcel when they were invaded. These guarantees are worthless. I'm saying don't let us make any more worthless guarantees and encourage people into attitudes which will lead to war on the basis of guarantees we have no intention of fulfilling. It's dishonest and it's actually barbaric. And as AJB Taylor memorably said, in 1940, would you rather have been a betrayed Czech or a saved Pole?
I think that if it was just Britain, and if we were starting from scratch, I think you'd still be wrong, but for chivalrous reasons rather than practical ones. I'd be criticising you. It is worth remembering that Britain was the midwife to the independence of Estonia and Latvia. These countries have enormous unrequited Anglophilia. Well, yeah, you may think it's a lot better to have even unrequited love than not have any at all. And I think there's something rather touching about the fact that the Baltic states and Poland, after all the terrible things we've done to them, still trust us. And I think it'd be good if we didn't let them down again. We let down the Baltic states with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement from 1935. We let them down again abominably in the 1940s and 50s with our botched intelligence operations. We betrayed Poland so many times you could hardly count. And now their security rests on the strength of particularly NATO, but also the EU, because a lot of this hybrid warfare attack isn't military, it's about energy and propaganda and all sorts of other subversion where the EU is the best guarantor rather than NATO. But we can win this. As I said, $40 trillion economy against a $2 trillion economy. If we want to, we can do this. We're not losing this war with Russia because we're weak. We're losing it because our willpower is weak, because we don't actually care. And Putin cares very much. And if we cared a bit more, we could win it. We don't have to send a British expeditionary force to France as we did in 1914. We need to do in the Baltic states, in answer to your question. The first thing to do is to make sure that the target isn't very tempting. We do that by having much better situational awareness, so we know what Russia's up to. We do a lot more, for example, the railway going across Lithuania, which is a major worry. We have persistent positioning of troops there, so Putin knows that if he crosses the border, he isn't just killing Estonians or Latvians, Lithuanians, and maybe Poles, but he's also killing Germans and French and Brits, and Americans and Canadians, lots of other people. That's the kind of West Berlin strategy. We defended West Berlin during the Cold War. West Berlin was militarily totally indefensible. There was no way we could actually defend West Berlin. The British, American and French brigades in West Berlin.
Right?
They were there to die bravely and slowly. But on the assumption that, in which the Soviets believed, and I think the Russians will believe if we make it credible, that if you attack this small, indefensible place, then the sky descends on you everywhere else. And that's what NATO is about. Attack on one is an attack on all. It's still a very powerful idea. We just have to stop undermining it and make it a bit more credible. And I think we can do that. We need to increase our defence spending a bit, not a huge amount. Even 1% of Germany's defence spending would be nice if it was spent on the right things instead of on the wrong things, which is being spent on at the moment. So I think this is we're getting ourselves into a great funk. Putin's like the Wizard of Oz. And you actually look at Russia. Russia is a failing state. Its economy is stagnant. It hasn't diversified. It exports raw materials of a kind that the world is needing less of rather than more of. It's a political failure, as we see at the moment. Its institutions are totally incapable of running the country properly. It's got a lot of nuclear weapons and big defence budget, and it's very good at lying about what it does and doing propaganda and scaring us. And the result is we're spooked. We don't need to be spooked.
There are a number of questions over here, but I'm just wary that all the questions are coming from the left wing of the room. And is there anyone over there who has a question that I've been ignoring? There's Natasha. So we'll have one question from the gentleman here, and then we will swing over that side before we come back to the other.
Did you want to go first?
No, you go first.
Okay, so I was in banking business in Central Eastern Europe for 40 years. My
My question is really going back to what Bill asked right at the beginning. Why was Poland sidetracked from the main discussion table about the future of security of Central Eastern Europe and Ukraine? Is it because French and German business interests are paramount in the discussion and not political security? And is it because it's unpalatable to France and Germany that the Poles have, in a sense, the best experience? Massive Germanization, Russification, deportations, murder, etc. And their voice and their opinions are unpalatable and could damage the economic interests of France and Germany.
I don't think Poland is very interesting that Poland, which has been systematically neglected by Germany for 25 years, is now a bigger trading partner, including energy, for Germany, than Russia, which is the Germans have been sucking up to. It's 84 billion, 23 billion. It's an astonishing sign of Polish economic success. It's one of the reasons why German policy has changed. The centre of gravity, the economic centre of gravity in German thinking has moved away from Russia towards, if you add in the other Visegrad countries, it's far more important than Russia, add in the Balts and the Bulgarians and Romanians, and it becomes an even bigger thing. That if you put all these so-called East European countries together, that are in the EU, they are Germany's single biggest trading partner. That's an astonishing. I think you'd have to check whether that's including French electricity or something. It's a very, very big chunk indeed. Why was Poland sidetracked? I think my explanation is it was a simple matter of that Donald Tusk wanted to have the top job in Europe, and he didn't want to get into any unnecessary rows, and he thought that being in the front line of diplomacy over Ukraine was going to cause have more downside than upside.
I'm from the Slovenian department, and I'm Russian, for that I apologize. And I would like to go slightly back to what you said about the invasion of the Baltics, and then perhaps Sweden and Norway and so on. And I really am struggling to understand how is it envisaged in the West that it's going to happen? And what is Russia really? It might be a failing state. I'm not a judge of that. I don't think anyone else is either. A lot of what we say about that is just supposition. But my question is, how is it going to happen? Putin has been accused of many things, but he's never been accused of being stupid. And I just wonder, why would he want to invade obviously nations that are hostile, that are going to probably do the Donbass on him, and even spread even further? Why would he do that? There aren't any resources there yet. Maybe oil is discovered or gas, but then other nations might be interested, and I can think of one nation that would be very interested in this. So my question, I really genuinely want to understand that this is barrage of fear and whipping up of fear. Is it based on some kind of geopolitical ground considerations, or is it a real fear? I mean, I don't mean people in these countries, but I mean the governments of this country. Does the West, I mean governments in the West, really believe that Putin will, just because he annexed Crimea, that he will really invade the Baltics, and then Poland, and then Sweden, and then how far will he go?
I don't think anyone's saying there are going to be Russian tanks going through the streets of Stockholm. But if people didn't, I mean, a lot of people argued exactly like you did in 10, 15 years ago. Why on earth should we worry about this? And so you saw countries like Sweden and Denmark basically getting out of territorial defence, and Latvia and Lithuania as well. There was no threat, so you don't need to waste money on doing this. And then we saw things like Zapad 2009, which was the most sinister and scary military exercise we'd seen in Europe since the early 1980s. With the rehearsing, where we could see that they didn't allow Western observers, so it was very hard. We had minimal observations conducted largely in secrecy, but rehearsing the invasion and occupation of Baltic states, and then this nuclear attack on Warsaw. Then we saw the event of Good Friday Good Friday 2013, where Russian warplanes flying between Crimea and between Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg suddenly turned around and made a dummy bombing run, one against Stockholm, against the intelligence headquarters in Stockholm, and the other against the air defence headquarters in southern Sweden, and and simultaneously while doing so jammed the Swedish air defence radar. That's actually an act of war if someone jams your air defence radar. The Swedish Air Force couldn't respond because Sweden let its Air Force go home at the weekend. There was no Swedish Air Force on duty. They had to rely on the planes, the NATO air policing squadron in Lithuania to come and intercept these countries. Now, this scares people. It really scares people. Now, I think one of the reasons Russia's doing it is psychological warfare. They want people to feel scared. They want people to feel it's hopeless. They want people in the Baltic states to feel, when you're in trouble, NATO isn't coming. Peter Hitchens is right. You are faraway countries of which we know nothing. We are not coming to help you. Because once politicians feel that it's hopeless, then Russia has a chance of getting what it wants, which is basically Bulgaria. Bulgaria is the perfect example of what Russia is doing. Bulgaria is nominally a NATO country and nominally an EU country. It is one where the major political and economic decisions are taken not by Bulgarian politicians on their own behalf, but because they're Russian proxies. And that's a really scary fate. And I can quite see why the Balts and the Estonians and Lithuanians...
But I don't think you answered my question. Why do you think Putin would want to do that?
Because he sees a great opportunity.
Why do you think?
Because NATO could be over by breakfast. If you do something to the Baltic states, just imagine something happens in the Baltic states, an ethnic thing, the railway going across Kaliningrad, and they scream blue murder. Their pain needle is going like that, and they say to NATO, "This is an Article 5 situation. We need your help now." And the phone goes to the White House. Obama is woken up in the middle of the night and told, "We have seen." We have an Article 5 request from NATO. We also noticed that Russia's put its nuclear weapons on alert and deployed its air defence missiles in its own territories, it's entitled to do. What are we going to respond? Now, if Obama does not respond by giving his representative at the North Atlantic Council the authority to give an Article 5 response, deploying large numbers of NATO forces in the Baltic states, NATO is over by breakfast. And that's something that Putin really like that.
Could I have a go at answering your question?
Okay.
This is a terrifying illustration of an important truth. Ed is one of the nicest, most intelligent, most well-read, best informed people I know. He's probably more intelligent, better read, better informed than most of the people in most Western governments. And he genuinely thinks this. And this is the danger that we're in, that there are lots of people in Western governments who have indeed talked themselves into this mad belief that Russia is about to invade the Baltic states. And they actually do think it. Just as the same people thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in 2003. This happens in Western governments, and it happens in Western media as well. And if you speak out against it, then people call you all kinds of rude names and claim you are a Russian agent and you take money from them. I get it all the time. Actually, all I'm trying to do is say, please, calm down. This isn't so. There is no evidence of it. And if I asked Edward to come up with any evidence that Russia desires to invade the Baltic states, he couldn't come up with any because there isn't any. And I might add, by the way, that we're talking about this kind of thing. Since early 2014, military activity by NATO aircraft on Russia's borders has doubled and is currently running at 3,000 sorties a year. So it's not just Russians who are flying planes close up against other people's airspace. It's us. Why are we doing this? Why are we playing this game
There's a very big difference, Peter.
Our planes are democratic. That's the
The difference is that our planes are doing, and when our planes exercise, they have their transponders switched on. And when Russia has its planes exercising, they have their transponders switched off. And the SAS flight from Copenhagen to Warsaw 3 months ago was 9 seconds away from mid-air collision. No one has been able... I asked Lavrov this in Munich, and I said, why are your planes flying around with their transponders switched off? This is like driving a black lorry through the streets of Cambridge at high speed late at night with its lights switched off. Why are you doing that?
I'm sorry, this isn't true. I spent a long time with the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, by the way, not the Russian one, discussing this matter. Airplanes are informed of the presence of other airplanes in airspace by air traffic control. All modern aircraft are. The fact that the transponders are switched off doesn't in any way alter this. Air traffic control knows where they are. The danger is not substantial. It is true. It is true. I spent an hour talking to a senior RAF officer about it. It is true. That is the case. That is why a lot of this stuff really needs to be taken with a very large amount of salt. If it were not true, then why don't they crash?
Okay, we're running short on time, so we have a lot of questions. So what I'd like to do is just get the questions.
We have a question from the Ukrainian chap.
Make sure it's from the right bit of Ukraine.
Request from the party.
Thank you. I don't know if being from the east of Ukraine is the right part of Ukraine, but so I mean, there's lots of threats and intimidation, propaganda from both sides of from both the Russian and the European West, or whatever you would like to call it. But in terms of cold hard facts, Ukraine is and always was, at least in my knowledge, very sharply divided between East and West, with the more Western-leaning people in the West and more Russian-leaning people in the East. And this has been demonstrated pretty much every non-trivial election or poll in Ukraine for the past, well, this is my lifetime. So, and what we're seeing now is the pro-Western side, which won in last year's events, is now bombing and killing the people on the East side. And so, wouldn't you argue that in terms of actual violence and people dying, it is actually the European side is actually killing and attacking the Russian side rather than the other way around, no matter how intimidating Putin might seem?
I must have missed this, but where are the people from Mariupol who are trying to attack Lugansk? I see plenty of people from Lugansk and Donetsk who are trying to attack Mariupol, but I did see these cities in eastern Ukraine. Kharkiv seems very keen to continue not being. I didn't see anyone asking to be in the Kharkiv People's Republic or Mariupol People's Republic.
I have for what it's worth. There have been various demonstrations and attacks that are being violently suppressed in both Kharkiv and Mariupol for this. I personally seen it and I've heard people from there talk about it. So from what I can see, most of eastern Ukraine now, well, most of Ukraine in general, but East more so, lives under pretty much permanent suppression of basically of what they want. And with so much propaganda being pumped at them, it's basically not easy to determine what everyone wants, especially if someone were to express negative sentiment towards the current government or pro-Russian sentiment, they will immediately be either arrested or beaten up or even worse, killed.
Could I just say something about this? I'm very glad that you said that, because I subscribe to the OSCE bulletins, which you can easily do, which come from their very credible and extremely courageous monitoring teams, which have been in the middle of this since it began. And there's no question, both sides are doing terrible things, and both sides break the ceasefire. But there is no question that in very many cases, the Ukrainian army, such as it is, has killed Ukrainian civilians by extreme laxity and by aiming both very inaccurate rockets and not particularly accurate artillery fire directly into residential areas. And if any government not liked by the Western media, Western governments had done this, it would be condemned ceaselessly for that crime of killing its own people, which is often taken as a reason for deposing the person who does it. And this has been going on for months and months and months, and many thousands of entirely innocent people have suffered terribly as a result of it, and it's a shocking reflection on my trade that it isn't more important. There's also the state of affairs in the city of Odessa, where there are very many people who sympathize with the eastern Ukrainians who are living under a sort of state of terror at the moment, many of whom are victims of an outrageous atrocity, which again has been underreported. There are different stories in Ukraine, and one thing I will ask all of you about Ukraine, because it is a very curious fact, and it tells you something about the people who run it and the nature of its governance and its independence. Apart from the fact that they suppressed in 1992 by threats of force an attempt to hold a referendum in Crimea about independence, which they did, which is very, very important. Apart from that fact, can you think of any other country which has a language understood by 100% of its people, and that language is not an official language, and that language is Russian? This is extraordinary behavior by any government that actually refuses to allow a language understood by 100% of its population to be an official language on nationalist political grounds. The view of what Professor Sacco calls the monist Ukrainian Western Ukrainian nationalists, of Ukrainian nationalism, is incredibly intolerant towards Russian speakers and those who live in the East. And it's one of the main reasons why the country is in such turmoil at the moment. It needs to be examined. It's underreported. People should know more about it.
Okay, well, we're running very short on time, so if we get a quick succession of questions or comments, and then we'll return to our speakers for final remarks. So we've got Molly Kostavenska, two gentlemen here, and one at the back who've been waiting quite a long time. We'll see if we can get to anyone else from there. If you can keep them as brief as possible.
Okay. So my question is an attempt to bring the topic back to Poland, maybe. And so I find it very fascinating that NATO enlargement has been questioned so much recently among scholars and analytics. And it's particularly fascinating to me because obviously, as it was said here before, NATO enlargement didn't just happen, but it was the countries themselves who really wanted it and were pressing for it. And someone at a conference that I attended recently said, this happened because NATO had to come to terms with its own values and its own identity and basically come to the conclusion that it cannot deny these countries' membership. What I see with NATO enlargement being questioned so much recently, I actually see kind of a decline of the idea of Western values or a deep crisis of Western values, which, ironically enough, actually it's the outsiders, such as pro-Western elites in Ukraine, who actually seem to believe more in the fact that the EU or NATO membership will bring them something special, whether it's true or not, whether I absolutely agree that just being part of the EU isn't going to help anything, but the fact that it is perceived as an opportunity means that actually these groups believe in these values more. Now, given that there's such a crisis, what role could be of Poland in this, given that Poland has undergone this accession itself and kind of, it was very special for Poland, and I have the feeling that it's a country that believes more in the idea of the West than some other Western countries.
Okay, we quickly go around. Two more after this.
I'm Charles, I'm a chemical engineering student at this college, so sorry for displaying historical illiteracy. But in the discussion in relation to the neutrality of this region, Nodes mentioned the NPT, and my understanding of it was that the conditions for Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal is that it agreed to be a non-aligned state, so not towards the US and not towards Russia. And it seems to me like EU encroachment to this area is kind of breaking that treaty a little bit, so maybe I'm wrong, but in any case, I guess the point still stands about the fact that the EU is, and NATO generally push towards, and then the fact that you've got these EU demonstrators in Ukraine is making it in a more non-aligned state. And as an analogy to me, it seems like when you're a little child and you poke your older brother incessantly until he reacts and then you cry about the result, it seems to me a bit confected. So why are we seeking this situation which is not going to lead to a better and more peaceful tomorrow?
Okay, pass the mic right back. Well, we've skipped the person right in the middle there.
Thank you.
Yes, that's right.
That's all right.
Briefly as you can.
Yes, I'll try to be really brief. I think one of the advantages of the European Union is peace, and I think among other reasons, peace is brought about by the fact that the people, not the governments, but the people, communicate a lot with each other. Diplomacy is very transparent, there's a lot of contact. Now, Mr. Hitchens spoke about the demonization of Putin, and whilst I don't know if I totally agree with you on that, I think what worries me a lot is I think there is a very bad communication between the Russian people and the European people on the Ukrainian affair. There's a lot of differences in what the media reports in Europe and in Russia. There's a very bad communication. I spoke to Russian friends that they absolutely don't have the same access to information than me, and I don't read Russian, and I don't understand the Russian people. So both of you are journalists, and I was wondering if you could give us an idea of what journalists could actually do to improve the communication between Europeans and Russians, to actually ease down the tension by a better access to common information, common good flow of communication between the two people. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman in the back has been waiting.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Juba. I'm a MBA student at Cambridge University. My question is to Mr. Peter. I'm from Georgia. You just mentioned the Tagliamini report. which said that Georgia started the war, but I would like to remind you that in Taliani's report there was a precondition to the war, which also stated that very big role was played by Russia for igniting the conflict and doing everything possible so Georgia maybe made mistake of firing the first shot. My genuine question is that, like, I'm just saying that we are justifying Russian position. My question is that why are we doing this? Are we intimidated, or we really do not believe in the common values, European values, the fundamentals, which should be governing the international relationships, and not the systems which were prevailing during the Richelieu era? Thank you.
One more person who's been waiting a long time, and we'll go to the concluding statements.
Hi, I'd like to talk about how we know what we know. If you could comment, perhaps tying the question about journalism, about what information we have about what Russia thinks about this, how we can rely on it, and not just we in the West, but also these countries on the border, what they know and how accurate that is.
Shall we prefer?
I would first.
You did. We've quickly run through the question as far as I can. I think Poland has been kept out of this because Poland isn't central to it. It's fundamentally an American policy. This is another fascinating part of Alan Susie's book. The First World War ended, to some extent, the independent action in foreign affairs of any major European country, and that all European politics since then, and especially since the Second World War, has been driven by United States interest, and the United States wasn't particularly interested in Poland's concerns in this. I think there are other historical problems about Poland, because as Vladimir Putin is supposed to have told one Polish leader, Lvov is, after all, a Polish city. If you start opening up territorial questions in this area, then all kinds of other things arise about who owns what and where it belongs and who should have it. On the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, Edward and I both think that you're mistaken about that it didn't contain that. What I do believe, though, is in the founding documents of Ukraine, when it was set up as an independent country, it was stated, I think in its constitution, that it would be non-aligned. And it's had to be, a bill has had to go through the Narada to alter that in the past few months, so that it can align itself with the EU. I'm always amused by the idea that the European Union has brought peace. The European Union has, to my knowledge, never resolved any major conflict between France and Germany, which was the conflict it was designed to institutionalize. There simply haven't been any conflicts between France and Germany which could have led to war since the formation of the original European communities. And the European Union has, on the other hand, contributed greatly to war, both in former Yugoslavia and now in Ukraine. So I don't think that the claims of the European Union to promote peace are worth anything. As to what journalists should do, I think one of the main things that they should do is make sure that any attempt to stampede the population into war by hysteria and misinformation and historical illiteracy should be resisted by responsible people. And if you hear a dissenting voice expressed on the radio or on the television or see it in the newspapers, you should pay some attention. And if you see nothing but a sea of agreement, then you should be tremendously suspicious, because the British establishment is never more wrong than when it is united. On any subject you care to name, if they are united, they will be wrong. The question, how do we know what we know, is a tremendous question, and often the answer is we don't actually know what we claim to know. My brother famously said he became a journalist so he wouldn't have to rely on newspapers to find out what was going on. And it's not a bad point. A lot of things we presume, sometimes we can guess that we know. It is actually the case, in my view, that political figures often tell the truth in major speeches, that we think are long and tedious orations, but actually, when studied, do contain quite often what they really mean. And I think we should listen carefully to what these people say, because they spend a lot of time drawing up what they say, and you can tell. And often very frightening things are contained in what they say. And when you find major statesmen comparing Vladimir Putin to Hitler, and when you read the kind of things which Paul Wolfowitz said when he drew up his doctrine, which is now followed, then you find something very interesting. Whenever you are told that intelligence information tells you such and such, unless the person involved can tell you exactly who he got it from and where and when, I would treat it with as much suspicion as you did weapons of mass destruction. People, journalists who claim to be the conduits of intelligence information are often being used by people rather than actually being journalists. And you need to be aware of it. But skepticism in all these things is extremely useful. A lot of what you're told will not be true. I'll move on from that to my final point, which is this. All that I came here to do was, I genuinely fear that the current atmosphere in the media and politics, the very poor level of information among many people about this fascinating, beautiful and important part of the world, means that we are quite possibly moving towards a situation where war in Europe is again possible. One of the main ways in which that can be prevented is that people such as you are aware all the time that attempts are being made to manipulate you, and that you resist them. You may not believe a word that I've said, and I don't really mind whether you do or not, because that's another matter. What I ask you to do is to examine skeptically any and all statements which would tend to favour moves towards a war in Europe. There is nobody in this room who would benefit from such a war. War is, and as a journalist, I'm not a war correspondent. I hate going to war zones. I've only ever arrived in 2 of them by accident. I can tell you one thing absolutely for certain: war is hell. Nobody wants it. There is no good reason for starting one, and anybody who acts in ways which are likely to start wars should be treated as irresponsible people that they are. Beware of it. Be skeptical. Listen carefully. Check. Ask. How do these people know what they say they know? Ask why are they saying what they're saying. You will do yourselves and this country and your countries, if you're not from this one, a great deal of good simply by doing that. Thank you very much.
Well, I would agree with Peter that I think there's a serious danger of war in Europe, which I didn't think I was going to see in my lifetime. I also agree with Peter that it's a very good idea not to reopen territorial questions. One of the most important things that has happened in Europe since 1989 has been the attempt not to change borders by force. It hasn't been completely successful, and I think you're quite right to highlight the failure of European diplomacy on Cyprus. But once you start combine the idea of historical injustice with the idea that having compatriots or kith and kin or Volksgenossen or Sotesisniki or whatever you call them on the other side of the border gives you rights, you are opening such an enormous can of worms that the results can only be awful. I go back to the point I made about agency. These are real countries. It's not up for us to say whether Ukraine should be in NATO, in the EU, in the Eurasian Economic Union, or they can join the Intergalactic Union. They can do whatever they want. All we are fighting for is a system in which countries can make their own choices and not have them imposed. We think our system's better. I think it's absolutely right that we spend money on trying to promote civil society and free media and doing all these things, ecology and all the rest of it. And that's fine. But in the end, it is up to the Ukrainians to decide. I don't actually agree that Ukraine is deeply divided. Ukraine is an example of a multilingual country, a bilingual country, in a way it's quite hard for monoglot countries like Britain to understand. It's also interesting that some of the people doing the fighting on the so-called Western side speak absolutely beautiful Russian because they're middle-class, educated Russians from Kiev. And the people on the other side are speaking this strange mixture of Russian-Ukrainian, which is a sort of Creole. On information, I would just say listen to the people who know best. Listen to the people who've really lived up close to this. Listen to people like my late friend Boris Nemtsov. He was warning about this. Listen to people like what Václav Havel said, what Leonard Merry said. Listen to people from the frontline states because they see this more clearly. They do this all the time. We've just been doing it part-time. And I don't recognise the consensus. I wish there was one. I wish people would wake up to what's going on. I wish particularly they'd wake up to the disgusting effect of Russian money, of dirty Russian money on our public life, on the politicians and think tanks, newspapers, universities, all the other places where Putin's been able to buy influence. If you don't think Russia's a threat, just look round at the way in which Russian money is seeped, not only in this country, other countries, the United States, and how it distorts our decision-making. That's the home front, if you like, and that's, in a way, the first place I think we should start fighting.
join me in thanking our guests, Edward Lucas and Peter. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming and for participating in this discussion so actively. I'd like to remind you of upcoming events in Cambridge Polish Studies. On March 30th, we have the next Kinoteka Polish Film Club screening, a film called Rebuttals, which is a recent Polish film. And then on April the 28th, we're hosting Poland's greatest living poet, Adam Zagajewski, here in Cambridge for a reading of his poetry and the presentation of the prize for translation, best translation of a poem from Polish into English by one of our students here at Cambridge. So I very much hope that you can join us for that event. You can find out about Cambridge Polish Studies through our Facebook page, Cambridge Polish Studies, but also through a website that you'll find through a simple Google search. Thank you very much for attending tonight.